1952 on, the work of the programs of the Claim Conference, which support Holocaust survivors, continues today. The keynote speaker of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day 2021 is Stuart Eizenstat, who for decades has played a major role in the negotiations that have greatly expanded their original program of the Claims Conference. During the Carter administration, Stuart Eizenstat was Chief White House Domestic Policy Advisor. His recommendation to President Carter led directly to the creation of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. In his role as Special Representative of the President and the Secretary of State on Holocaust Era Issues during the Clinton administration, he successfully negotiated agreements with European banks, insurance companies, and governments, covering communal and private property restitution or compensation payment to slave and forced laborers, both Jewish and non-Jewish, recovery of looted art with 42 nations, bank accounts, and payment of insurance policies. Working with Swedish Prime Minister Göran Persson, the International Holocaust Education Working Group was created, now the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, with over 30 countries to promote Holocaust education in their school systems. In 2000, he negotiated the Teresian Declaration, and in 2010, the best practices and guidelines for restitution or compensation of real, immovable property confiscated by the Nazis or their collaborators with over 40 countries. He currently serves as expert advisor to the State Department on Holocaust Era Issues and special negotiator on behalf of the Jewish Claims Conference. His book, Imperfect Justice, Looted Assets, Slave Labor, and the Unfinished Business of World War II, has been widely acclaimed and translated into several languages.
Privileged Rabbi Shmuel Katzman of the Rabbinate The Hague asked me to deliver these remarks in The Hague on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. I'm speaking from the hallowed grounds of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which I helped create with President Carter, and want to especially thank the director of the museum, Sarah Bloomfield, and Diane Saltzman, the head of Constituency Affairs, for making this possible at a time of COVID-19. Since it opened in 1993, almost 50 million people have visited, 3/4 non-Jews. I speak to you at a troubling time of a rising tide of hatred against minorities and anti-Semitism, and appalling declines in knowledge about the Holocaust and its contemporary lessons, particularly by young people, as more and more of the 350,000 survivors, eyewitnesses, are leaving us. But it's also a time when there are genocides and potential genocides around the world. If we're to take seriously the pledge never again, we must apply the lessons of the Holocaust to contemporary 21st century challenges. There was nothing inevitable about the Holocaust, nor is there anything inevitable about the genocides in the world today. The Shoah is a tragic example of what happens when people are ill-informed, indifferent, and inactive in the face of evil, when neighbor turned against neighbor because of their religion, and when the Western world refused to act because of prevailing anti-Semitism. Jews were expendable then, just as other religious minorities are in the 21st century genocides, although none of the magnitude, for sure, of the Holocaust. Hitler's initial goal was to make Germany Judenrein, free of Jews. Hitler proceeded carefully, waiting to judge German public and world reaction, and seeing none, he took one step after another, first passing racial laws, then isolating Jews, barring them from professions, destroying synagogues and businesses in Kristallnacht, expropriating their property and possessions, and then deporting them to concentration camps, finally murdering 6 million Jews, including 1.5 million children. 2/3 of European Jewry, the flower of Jewish culture, religion, scholarship, and enterprise, and 1/3 of all Jews in the world. At the outbreak of World War II in 1939, there were 17 million Jews in a world of 2 billion. Today, there are only 14.7 million Jews in a world of 7 billion. The German people acquiesced or even supported seeing their neighbors dispossessed and deported, and the world failed to act, including the United States. Hitler got a clear signal and said so publicly that the world did not care about protecting the Jews, and he had a free hand to commit the worst genocide in world history. At the Amiens Conference in July 1938, called by President Roosevelt to deal with the plight of German Jewish refugees, he sent low-level representatives and failed to take the lead in lifting rigid immigration quotas as an example to the rest of the world, while at the same time the State Department did all it could to restrict immigration. The SS St. Louis in May 1939, carrying over 900,000 German Jews, sat for days outside Miami and was not allowed to land. No sanctions were imposed on Germany before the U.S. finally entered the war. President Roosevelt had substantial evidence about the growing dimensions of the Holocaust, but failed to act, including a personal visit by the courageous Polish diplomat Jan Karski, who gave him and Justice Frankfurter his personal account of the Warsaw Ghetto. Because of the high levels of anti-Semitism in America at the time, for FDR did not want to make World War II seem like a war for the Jews. Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, publisher of the New York Times, gave his editors instructions to bury stories of the Holocaust, concerned his paper would be viewed as a Jewish paper. Nor did the American Jewish leadership do all they should have to pressure FDR to act more urgently on behalf of Europe's beleaguered Jews, likewise afraid of rising anti-Semitic sentiments. In the immediate post-war days, Nazi atrocities were revealed with the liberation of death camps and filmed at the insistence of Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower. While Americans were shocked by newsreels of the death camps, the staggering dimensions of the Shoah were not understood, and the Holocaust was quickly given a back seat as the focus of the U.S. and the West was the Cold War against the Soviet Union. There was little demand for justice beyond the Nuremberg trials of only a tiny fraction of the Nazi perpetrators. Jewish survivors were often poorly treated. Jews trying to reclaim their confiscated homes in Poland and Lithuania were killed, and post-war property restitution laws in countries like France, Austria, and the Netherlands were unsatisfactory. They lived in squalid displaced persons camps after the war. General George Patton, whose forces liberated concentration camps, ordered guards to monitor survivors as if they were inmates in prison. President Truman's representative on refugees, Earl Harrison, wrote him a scathing report after visiting the DP camps, and he said, "As matters now stand, we appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except we don't exterminate them. They're in concentration camps in large numbers under our military guard instead of SS troops. One is left to wonder whether the Germans seeing this are not supposing that we're following or at least condoning Nazi policy." Great Britain kept 52,000 survivors trying to reach Palestine in squalid camps in Cyprus, some up to 5 years. Survivors rarely told their stories because they wanted to shield their children from the horrors through which they went and needed to focus on building a new life in the United States, Israel, or Europe. Authors like Elie Wiesel had difficulty finding publishers, in Elie's case for his book Night. In 1962, Rabbi Irving Greenberg was denied the opportunity to teach a course on the Holocaust at Yeshiva University because it was not considered a proper topic for academic study. But the monstrous dimensions of the Holocaust could not be hidden, although action to deal with its origins and consequences was slow and painful. In 1968, Arthur Morse published While 6 Million Died, a shocking description of what FDR knew about the genocide of the Jews and failed to act on. He was a colleague of mine on the Hubert Humphrey presidential campaign against Richard Nixon, and his revelations changed my life and committed me on a course to pursue Holocaust justice for survivors and memory for those who perished. A whole genre of books followed by major historians, and wider audiences were introduced to the Holocaust in 1978 by NBC's widely watched miniseries, Meryl Streep's film Sophie's Choice, Claude Lanzmann's classic 1985 9-hour documentary Shoah, and Steven Spielberg's Academy Award-winning 1993 Schindler's List. At last, the Holocaust seemed firmly embedded in the public consciousness, but it's now slipping over the decades. But beyond books and movies, the Holocaust created for the first time in the history of warfare a legal process by which a country which had abused and murdered its civilians, both its own citizens and those of countries it occupied, agreed to compensate survivors. In September 1951, the first post-war German Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, accepted responsibility in his words for, quote, the unspeakable crimes that have been committed in the name of the German people, end quote. 1 month after Adenauer's speech, Dr. Nachum Goldman, president of the World Jewish Congress, convened a meeting in New York City of 23 major Jewish organizations, and speaking for the collective Jewish world, created the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, the Claims Conference. Beginning in The Hague in 1952, March to be precise, negotiations commenced between Germany, led by Chancellor Adenauer, and the young state of Israel, led by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. Beginning in The Hague in March 1952, negotiations commenced between Germany, led by Chancellor Adenauer, and the young state of Israel, led by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, and parallel negotiations between the German government and the Claims Conference. In a historic agreement in Luxembourg on September 10, 1952, the Claims Conference and the West German federal government signed 2 protocols. One called for German laws that would compensate Nazi victims directly. The first post-war international agreement by the new German state was actually with Israel and a Jewish NGO and became embedded in domestic German law. The second protocol provided the Claims Conference with 450 million Deutschmarks for the relief, rehabilitation, and resettlement of Jewish victims of the Holocaust. These negotiations were so controversial that they took place under the cloak of secrecy. Menachem Begin and his IHRD party led violent demonstrations outside the Knesset with a banner that read, "Our honor cannot be sold for money. Our blood shall not be atoned by goods. We shall wipe out the disgrace." After 3 days of emotional debate, the vote was very close. Only 61 of the 120 members voted in favor. Letter bombs were sent to the delegations. Nor was it easy on the German side. The major reason the agreement passed was the unswerving resolve of Chancellor Adenauer. His own CDU finance minister, Schaefer, was opposed, and some of his party voted against it in the Bundestag, while others abstained. It passed because every member of the Social Democrats supported it. The first major German Holocaust compensation program under the German Federal Indemnification Laws, the BEG, provided lifetime pensions to a subset of survivors. It is critical to understand that today in 2021, there are around 350,000 Holocaust survivors around the world, of whom at least 50% are poor or near poor. 90% of those in the former Soviet Union and in Central and Eastern Europe, 35 to 40% in Israel, and around 30% in the United States. Germany has paid over $80 billion since the 1950s. Almost all of the major provisions the claims conference has negotiated with Germany go only to survivors in economic need. More than half of the 350,000 survivors receive some form of payment from the German government. The history of claims conference negotiations with Germany over the decades has been to expand the number of survivors eligible for payment as we tracked Germany's post-war history, a history of which post-war Germany can be proud. In 1980, the original role of the claims conference expanded with the creation of the Hardship Fund to provide direct one-time payments to Nazi victims who had received no prior compensation, and primarily benefiting those who had emigrated from the Soviet Union in the 1970s. Over the past 40 years, approximately 525,000 Jewish Nazi victims benefited from hardship payments, of whom around half remain alive. Many are from the former Soviet Union and fled almost certain murder by the Nazi Einsatzgruppen that followed the Wehrmacht in its eastern advances. I coined the term double victims of Nazism and communism, and they're often the poorest of Jewish victims. Beginning in 2009, I became the chief negotiator for the Claims Conference, along with Holocaust survivor Roman Kent and a negotiating team of survivors from the UK, Poland, Israel, and the US, brilliantly managed by Greg Schneider, Executive Vice President, Counsel Karen Heilig, and Rudy Malo in Berlin. Since then, we've obtained over $9 billion of additional benefits, especially in home care and increased pensions. In our September 2020 negotiations, we secured over 650 million euros for a supplemental hardship payment to the poorest survivors. The next major development followed the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of the two Germanys. The U.S. government supported the Claims Conference demand for the compensation of Holocaust survivors, and this was incorporated into Article 2 of the implementation of the German Reunification Treaty of 1990, in which the German government was prepared to enter into agreements with the Claims Conference to provide payments to survivors who had thus far received no or only minimal compensation. After 16 months of difficult negotiations, the Article 2 Fund was established in 1992, providing a lifetime pension to those under certain income limits who were in camps, ghettos, or hiding for a prescribed period of time. Since 2009, we've negotiated liberalized criteria for the length of time in ghettos or living and hiding and covering open ghettos in several countries, including in North Africa, including an additional 18,000 survivors. In 1998, a similar pension program, the CEEF, was established in the former communist East Bloc countries. Over 135,000 survivors have been approved for pensions under these programs, and in 2021, over 50,000 survivors still receive Article 2 and CEF pensions. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany in 1990 led to another novel application of international law. The Claims Conference ensured, through German law, that former owners and heirs of property located in the former East Germany lost during the Nazi era were finally given the opportunity for restitution, the same as those who had property in the former West Germany. An equally novel agreement covered unclaimed or heirless Jewish property where whole families had been wiped out. Germany agreed that the Claims Conference would be designated as a successor organization. Rather than the property reverting to the German government, the Claims Conference became the owner on behalf of Jewish victims of the Shoah. This resulted in the recovery and sale of $2 billion for the Claims Conference, the vast majority of which has been used since 1995 for welfare programs to assist needy survivors worldwide. We're constantly seeking to enlarge the compensation programs. In 2014, the Child Survivor Fund was created and has paid over 80,000 child survivors a one-time payment of 2,500 euros. In 2018, Children who fled Germany and Austria on the Kindertransport were also entitled to a payment from this fund. We've expanded the number of additional groups eligible for the hardship fund as well. A second unique feature in international law occurred during the Clinton administration under my leadership, and that is payment by private companies for the harm they caused to civilians during World War II. The Holocaust was not only the greatest genocide in history, it was the greatest theft in history, only a small fraction of which has been recovered. After the collapse of communism, Edgar Bronfman, president of the World Jewish Congress and the World Jewish Restitution Organization, met with President Bill Clinton in the White House to urge that a special envoy be appointed to encourage the newly democratic countries in Central and Eastern Europe to return communal property, synagogues, schools, community centers, even cemeteries, to the shattered Jewish communities seeking to rebuild their communal life after the twin tragedies of the Holocaust and communism. I became that special envoy. Taking on a dual role while I was U.S. ambassador to the European Union in Brussels, I traveled widely throughout the length and breadth of the region to put the moral weight of the United States government behind this effort. In the midst of this work, I read a 1994 article in the Wall Street Journal about dormant Swiss bank accounts established by Jews seeking to put their assets away from the grasp of the Nazis in the most secure banks in neutral Europe, but never returned to their rightful owners and taken into the profits of the banks. I got permission from the State Department to pursue this injustice. When I met in Basel, Switzerland with the Swiss Bankers Association, I showed them the Wall Street Journal article, which had featured Greta Beer, a survivor who couldn't find her bank account of her father. And I asked for their response. Yes, they said, there were 730 accounts found after having an ombudsman review the records of all Swiss banks from 1933 to 1945. And they were going to pay the owners $30 million to take into account interest over the decades. A May 2nd, 1996 memorandum of understanding signed between Edgar Bronfman, the Jewish Agency of Israel, and the Swiss banks created an independent committee of eminent persons chaired by a former chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, Paul Volcker, to conduct an independent audit of the wartime Swiss bank accounts. At the suggestion of the World Jewish Congress, Volcker retained an expert, Helen Ewens, to conduct a study of the pre-war Jewish wealth in Europe, which he estimated at $12.9 billion. After 3 years and more than $200 million in audit fees paid by the Swiss banks, the Volcker Committee issued its report, finding that some 54,000 accounts had probable or possible Jewish owners, and over 20,000 almost certainly did. The Swiss government remained uninvolved, putting the full burden on the private banks. I had led a 1997 interagency study showing that the government's central bank had helped finance the Nazi war effort by trading Swiss francs in return for gold they knew the Nazis had stolen from the coffers of the central banks of the countries they had overrun. Under the combined pressure of Edgar Bronfman, sensational Senate hearings chaired by Senator Al D'Amato of New York, class action lawsuits against the Swiss banks, my own mediation on behalf of President Clinton, and the critical intervention of U.S. District Court Judge Edward Corman, the Swiss banks agreed to a staggering settlement of $1.25 billion with a worldwide claims process. The Swiss bank settlement led to class action suits against German slave and forced labor companies who employed Jewish and non-Jewish workers, often working the Jewish workers to death, to which I mediated a settlement of $5 billion, 10 million Deutschmarks, in July 2000, which included $350 million for unpaid insurance policies. It was the first time Germany paid compensation to non-Jews, who actually got the majority of the funds. In January 2001, I mediated an $800 million settlement against Austrian companies with similar practices, along with $210 million to pay for the confiscation of Jewish private property, and then for French banks for also hiding Jewish accounts. Another novelty of international law was my negotiation in the Clinton administration with 42 countries in 1998 of the Washington Principles on Nazi confiscated art, establishing principles for the identification, publication, claims, and return of some of the 600,000 artworks the Nazis stole. The Washington Principles were amplified and broadened by the 47-nation Terezin Declaration, which I negotiated in 2009 in the Obama-Biden administration. Although not legally binding international law, their moral forces had a profound impact on the art world. 5 countries, the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, France, and the UK, have established claims commissions to adjudicate claims against public museums which hold these looted artworks. In 2018, the U.S. Congress passed the JUST Act, calling on the State Department to report on the implementation of the Terezin Declaration by its signatories, including the Netherlands, which it did in August 2020. Only a few weeks ago, a Dutch committee established by the Minister of Education, Science and Culture issued a stinging report critical of the process and policies employed by the Dutch Art Restitution Commission, perhaps leading to the resignation of its chairman. Thousands of paintings have been restituted or compensated due to the Washington Principles and Terezin Declaration. The 2 major art auction houses, Christie's and Sotheby's, have created full-time staffs to assure that they do not sell or auction Nazi-looted art, and Christie's has resolved over 100 claims. Monetary compensation or restitution are not the only ways to deal with victims of human rights and genocide. Another effective way is the creation of truth and reconciliation commissions, such as the one in South Africa, created by Nelson Mandela. These can avoid divisive retribution and lead to healing by giving victims a forum to describe their mistreatment. This was never done in post-war Germany. Holocaust education is now more critical than ever. During the initial post-war years, the Claims Conference was fundamental in providing critical funding for Yad Vashem, YIVO, Memorial de la Shoah in Paris, and the Wiener Library in London. The Claims Conference devoted a small part of the proceeds from heirless East German property for Holocaust education, research, and documentation. At its peak a few years ago, the Claims Conference was the single largest funder of Holocaust education, up to $18 million per year. But as the fund has dwindled, only a small fraction is available at the very time Holocaust awareness has dramatically dropped. In a major recent survey by the Claims Conference, 48% of American millennials and so-called Generation Z could not name a single one of the more than 40,000 concentration camps or ghettos established during World War II. 56% were unable to identify Auschwitz. 63% didn't know 6 million Jews were killed, and remarkably, 11% actually believed Jews caused the Holocaust. Roughly half have seen Holocaust denial or distortion posted on their social media platforms. However, the bright spot is that 64% felt that Holocaust education should be compulsory in their schools, and 80% believed it was important to learn about the Holocaust. In January 2000, then as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, I worked with the Prime Minister of Sweden, Göran Persson, to establish the Holocaust Education Task Force to promote Holocaust education, then with only a handful of countries. But this has now become the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance with over 30 countries. However, in the United States, only about 12 states have any form of required Holocaust education. There is progress. In 2020, the U.S. Congress passed the Never Again Education Act to provide $10 million to provide and promote Holocaust education through grants to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. In our September 2020 negotiations with the German government, concluded not long ago, they will provide the Claims Conference with 9 million euros in 2020, with an increase of 3 million euros each year, so there will be 18 million euros by 2023. Has the Holocaust taught the world anything? Are we any better for the lessons it should have given us? At one level, an argument can be made that we're repeating the mistakes of the Holocaust. After all, many acts of genocide and violations of human rights have occurred since the end of World War II. In Cambodia and Rwanda, Bosnia, Kosovo, Darfur, Syria, Myanmar, China, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, Ethiopia, and the list goes on without effective international intervention. But let me suggest that the world is slowly developing a set of international instruments that have the possibility of incorporating the lessons of the Holocaust, if combined with the will of the United States and our European allies. Let's look at how far we've come. Prior to World War II, individuals had no rights under international law and depended solely on how their nation, even Germany under Hitler, mistreated its citizens. No other state had a legal right to protest against the treatment of another state's abuse of its citizens within their territory, nor did individuals have a global forum to present their cases of mistreatment. This is not to say that nations were helpless to combat Hitler's mass murder of Jews, had they wished to do so. There's no question the Holocaust and the brutality of World War II has been a dramatic catalyst in improving the rights of individuals who now have internationally guaranteed rights and tribunals to assert them against states that violate them. But we always must be cognizant that these rights are fragile and depend heavily for their enforcement on other nations who act largely for their own interests. The Charter of the United Nations did not create an enforceable set of rights, given the strong opposition of the Soviet Union and the reservations of major Western allies, including the U.S. In order to get the U.S. Senate to ratify the UN Charter and avoid a repeat of the disastrous defeat of the Covenant of the League of Nations after World War I, the UN Charter had only vague language about promoting respect for human rights and fundamental freedom for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 adopted a non-binding UN resolution, which still remains a landmark. Since then, there have been numerous international agreements, such as the Genocide Convention, the International Covenants on Human Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, the Convention on the Rights of Children, the Convention Against Torture. In the early 1950s, the Council of Europe adopted the European Convention on Human Rights as a direct result of the Holocaust, which established the first organization allowing individuals the ability to sue states which violate their rights. The European Court of Human Rights, which remains active to this day, their judgments are largely honored. One expert, Thomas Bergenthal, has called the European Court the most effective international system for the protection of human rights in existence today. The International Court of Justice in The Hague was created in 1945 to be the principal civil court of the UN and to hear disputes between countries. In 2020, in a recent case brought by Gambia against Myanmar, the court issued a provisional decision aimed at protecting the Rohingya from further persecution under the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide. Moreover, international criminal law and institutions to enforce it has also evolved. This began, of course, with the Nuremberg Tribunal to try Nazi war criminals. In 1993, the UN Security Council established the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and several of the worst Serbian human rights offenders were tried and convicted, including Serb General Ratko Mladic. In 1994, the International Criminal Court for Rwanda was established following the Rwanda genocide. And in 2002, the International Criminal Court came into being, to which now over 120 nations, not unfortunately including the U.S., are parties. Radovan Karadzic, president of the Republic of Serbia, was convicted by the court, and 45 leaders, including Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, have been indicted by the court. There are other institutions today that did not exist during the Holocaust. Human rights NGOs like Human Rights Watch, Doctors Without Borders, HIAS, and Amnesty International highlight acts of genocide and war crimes. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's own Center for the Prevention of Genocide, to which I belong, thoroughly researches and works with members of the U.S. government to highlight areas where genocide is occurring or is at risk. The Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide has one of the largest education and training programs around the world to sensitize people to the dangers of genocide and mass atrocities through the lessons of the Holocaust. I chair the Defiant Requiem Foundation, which, with the vision of Murray Sidlin, has performed over 50 concert dramas in the U.S., Europe, and Israel, and increasingly in colleges and universities using student musicians and singers to dramatize the power of cultural resistance through the arts and music and giving people hope in a hopeless situation. We were scheduled to perform our landmark concert, Defiant Requiem Verdi at Theresen, in Amsterdam in May of 2020, which could have been broadcast nationwide on Dutch television. Because of COVID-19, this has been moved to 2021. The internet and digital communications and aggressive journalists can bring war crimes and acts of genocide directly into our homes to stir our conscience, something not possible during the Holocaust. For all its limitations, the United Nations, operating under a UN Security Council resolution since 1999, has numerous peacekeeping missions to protect civilians, providing some measure of protections Jews never had during the Holocaust. The limitations of international law, for sure, are all too painful. Nation-states are still the key drivers of the treatment of their citizens. International human rights are regularly violated by brutal autocrats around the world, with little ability of citizens to mobilize international law to protect themselves, unless it touches on the interests of Western and other nation-states. The U.S. and NATO, for example, intervened in Bosnia and then in Kosovo because the West in the end couldn't tolerate another genocide on its soil after the Holocaust. But many other massacres and genocides around the world do not capture the attention of the Western nations that could make a difference because they do not engage their strategic interests. A critical factor is the willingness of the President of the United States, along with the Congress, to make human rights a key part of American foreign policy. I'm proud that Jimmy Carter, who I served, was the first to do so, applying it to Latin American dictators, reducing their arms shipments, and using his bully pulpit to call for freedom and democracy in our hemisphere. Even while negotiating a nuclear arms agreement with the Soviet Union, President Carter championed the rights of Soviet Jews, leading to the doubling of Soviet Jewish immigration, and, by his own account, saving the life of Natan Sharansky from the false charge that he was a spy for the United States. Other presidents, from Nixon to Trump, give little attention to how nations treat their citizens and focus on their external conduct. I believe that President-elect Biden will put human rights back into a central role in his foreign policy. Of course, all presidents have to carefully balance American interests against human rights concerns, as in dealing, for example, with China. But making human rights at least a significant part of foreign policy can help advance its cause and protect vulnerable people from genocide. The Holocaust has been a stimulant in beginning to build a world in which human rights violations and genocide gained greater opprobrium. The most meaningful way to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is honored by the United Nations itself and dozens of other countries, including the United States and the Netherlands, is to pledge ourselves and to urge our governments to remember the lessons of the Holocaust and to take effective action against hate, anti-Semitism, human rights violations, and genocide, wherever it occurs and against whomever it is perpetrated. Thank you very much.